Well, we have a lot of programs here. I'm Dr. John Westerdahl. I'm a nutritionist and dietitian, also the director of our health committee here at the Simi Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we often have community health and wellness programs. I'm also a docent at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And of course, we have another couple of docents that came. Stand up. They're visiting today. Let's give them a hand. We all are docents on Sunday mornings usually, and some of you will be traveling to our Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit tomorrow. Those of you that have signed up and have registered for that already, we will be meeting at 8:45 at the entrance to the Reagan Presidential Library where the fountain is. And both our pastors will be there, and I'll be leading you through the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also afterwards, those of you that would like to, I'll lead you on a personal tour through the Presidential Museum and Library, which includes our wonderful museum. How many have been to the Reagan Library? Raise your hand. Oh, some of you already been there, but I'll take you on a tour. And you get to go on Air Force One, the airplane that was used by 7 different presidents. President Reagan used it more than all the other presidents combined. So we thought it very appropriate, because of our exhibit at the Reagan Library on the Dead Sea Scrolls, to have a special program here at our church here, just a few blocks away from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And I want to thank the Center for Near East Archaeology at La Sierra University. By the way, La Sierra University is a Seventh-day Adventist university located in Riverside, and they have a fabulous institute, Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, and they're working on a museum, and you're going to hear all about what some of their plans are and about that. We want to thank them for being a sponsor of this program by sending 2 of their illustrious speakers here today. And we're going to be talking about a lot of things on archaeology and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And our first speaker is Dr. Lawrence T. Geraty. Dr. Geraty received his Ph.D. from Harvard University. He is actually the President Emeritus of La Sierra University, which is located in Riverside, California. So he was the former president of the university. He previously taught archaeology and Hebrew Bible at Andrews University Seminary in Michigan. That's actually the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary located over in Michigan. And there he founded its Institute of Archaeology and the Horn Archaeological Museum. Now, Dr. Siegfried Horn, that was named after him, he was one of our very eminent biblical archaeologists in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it was quite world-renowned in that field. So he also directed the Jordanian field excavation associated with the university there. He has served on the editorial boards of the Biblical Archaeologists, Near East Archaeology, and the Biblical Archaeology Review, leading publications in the field of archaeology and biblical archaeology. Dr. Geraty first visited Qumran in 1953, and that's the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. When it was just being excavated, and he actually studied with the excavator of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Père, or also known as Father Roman de Vaux, who was actually a priest that started that work. He worked with Dead Sea Scrolls experts and researchers on actual Dead Sea Scroll texts. He will tell us now more about his work in the Dead Sea Scroll region and working with the Dead Sea Scrolls and at that site. And Dr. Geraty is now retired, and he keeps active and is continuing his part-time. A lot of those of us who are retired are always involved in some volunteer work. But he assists La Sierra University as the director of its foundation and also as the associate director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. So let's give Dr. Geraty a big hand up here. And they brought some things here to share with us today. You're using that mic, right?
Right. Well, thank you very much for your warm introduction and the opportunity to spend some time with you here today. I'll tell you a little bit about my life and how it got connected with the topic of Dead Sea Scrolls. My parents were missionaries in China. Took me to China in 1940 when I was just a baby. And World War II came along, and we were behind Japanese lines in interior China all during the war. But when the communists came, the family had to move, and the church transferred them to Beirut, Lebanon. So I spent my teenage years there. And that's where I first heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because Dr. Siegfried Horn, who you just heard described a moment ago, was coming to the Middle East for his very first visit to the Holy Land. He had grown up in Germany, attended Hebrew school because he could not go to the state schools on Sabbath, but the Hebrew schools obviously would not be open on Saturdays. So he grew up speaking Hebrew from Hebrew school. His mother was an Adventist Bible worker. He loved the Bible. He became very interested in archaeology, read everything he could, and eventually became a missionary for the church to what today is Indonesia. At that time, it was the Dutch East Indies. And World War II came along, and the Germans, as you remember from your history, invaded Holland in one day, took over the country. And the Dutch were so upset at the Germans for that they immediately imprisoned all the Germans who were living in Dutch territories in Southeast Asia. And so Siegfried Horn, being a German, was caught up in that situation and put in jail along with hundreds of other Germans, doctors, engineers, businessmen, missionaries, and so forth. And it's a long story. I won't tell you that whole story, but he was in jail for 7 years. When the Japanese headed south toward what's today Indonesia, the Dutch transferred their prisoners to the British in India. And there were 4 ships that were commandeered to take the prisoners from Sumatra to Calcutta. And there happened to be 2 German men with the surname Horn in the list of prisoners. And somehow they mixed the Horns up and put each of them on the wrong boat, the boat that the other one was supposed to be in. And those boats, as they headed for Indonesia, one of the boats was torpedoed with the loss of all life on board. And it was the boat that Siegfried Horn, that we're talking about, was supposed to be on, but wasn't. Miraculously, he got on the other ship. So his wife, who was Dutch and stayed at home in Batavia, now the capital of Jakarta of Indonesia, she was notified that her husband was lost at sea. And so for 7 years, that's what she thought she was a widow. But he instead was taken to this prison of war camp up in the Himalaya Mountains and was there until the end of the war. And finally, the General Conference found out about them and got him out. He came to the United States. This was his opportunity to learn more about archaeology. And so he finished his degree in just a few months. It's an American degree. Went off to graduate school, University of Chicago, the Oral Institute, got his Ph.D. in Egyptology there. And then he wanted to come and visit the Middle East. He'd never been to the Middle East. And so he came on his first visit, and he lectured on the Dead Sea Scrolls at Middle East University, which is the Adventist University in Beirut, Lebanon. And I was a teenager there. And I listened, met Dr. Horn, listened to him talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I got very interested in that. I thought, wouldn't that be fun someday to be an archaeologist? But as Providence, let's say, had it. I got into the ministry, I went to seminary, took all the classes that Dr. Horn offered in archaeology. I expected eventually to become a missionary myself. But Dr. Horn decided that he wanted me to succeed him. He was getting ready to retire. And so he asked the General Conference for me to come and teach at Andrews University. So I had to get my doctorate first, and eventually that's what I did, and ended up associated with him as he began the first Adventist-sponsored archaeological dig at a site called Heshbon in Jordan. And so he directed the first 3 seasons of operations there, and I worked with him, and then he became dean of the seminary and had me succeed him as the director of that project. And a later project that we continued to excavate, Dr. Bramlett joined us. And so Dr. Bramlett and I have worked with the longest serving excavation in the Middle East that still continues. It's called the Madaba Plains Project, and we've been going for more than 50 years. But as you've heard, I retired, and Dr. Bramlett is the director of the new project in Jordan that that Lassere University is sponsoring. So anyway, that's a little bit about my background and what I've done and how I got interested in Dead Sea Scrolls. Hearing Dr. Horn lecture when I was a teenager, and also then accompanying him to some of the sites that he had read about all his life, but visited for the very first time. So, since my parents were living there in Beirut, we had ready access to the various countries of the Middle East and could visit them on vacations. And as you heard, in 1953, we went down to Jordan, and I climbed all around the site of Qumran. And Ph.D., who you heard about, the famous French archaeologist who excavated the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, was working there at Qumran, just on the edge of the Dead Sea, the northwestern corner of the Dead Sea. And so I met him there for the first time, not realizing that when I went back to graduate school, I would have the opportunity to live in Jerusalem for a year. And I studied with him. He was a professor at what's called the École Biblique, the Biblical School of Archaeology and History in Jerusalem, run by the Dominican Fathers, Roman Catholic Church. So he wore this long white robe, and he would walk through the city of Jerusalem, and everybody got out of his way because he was a very impressive-looking man. He taught in French, of course, and so I had the privilege of learning all about the excavation from the man who did the work. Later on, I was in graduate school at Harvard, as you have heard, and I had 2 major professors. One was a man named G. Ernest Wright, who's a very well-known archaeologist and biblical scholar, and the other was Frank Moore Cross, who is famous because of his work with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he was involved in the publication for the first time of many of these scrolls. And he had them there in his office, and I had the privilege of working with him on the ones that he was working on, because he had the graduate school involved in that, graduate students involved in that. And one of my classmates was an Israeli young man who came to study with Professor Cross, specifically because he was interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. His name was Emmanuel Tove, and that classmate ended up graduating from Harvard also, and then going back to Israel and teaching at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And when the original generation of scholars who worked with the Dead Sea Scrolls and translated them were all retiring, getting older, Dr. Tove was appointed the director of the whole project to get the Dead Sea Scrolls actually completely published. And he succeeded in that a few years ago. And so all the scrolls are completely published and available both online and in books and so on for scholars to work with. So I've had the privilege, as you can see, of being involved with the Dead Sea Scrolls right from the start. I have one additional interesting story to tell you about our relationship to the scrolls. When Dr. Bramlett and I were working in what we call the Madaba Plains Project in Jordan, we started, after finishing Heshbon, the site that Siegfried Horn had chosen, for a new site, we chose a place called Umeiri. And Dr. Bramlett should tell you about that, but I will just say that at one time, scholars thought that it was impossible for the Israelites to come out of Egypt and go through Transjordan on their way to the Holy Land because it was not occupied during the time that the Bible says they were there. But at our site, we excavated a temple that was several meters high. Obviously, people were living there during the time that the Bible says the Israelites went through. And Dr. Bramlett excavated this temple. It's a very, very important and interesting project. But anyway, on this general project, we were working at the site called Umeiri, near Heshbon, sites that the Israelites had gone through on their way to Canaan. And we decided that we also wanted to work at another site called Jalul that had a similar occupation history to the one we were at. We got permission from the government, but not only did the government give permission, but we wanted to talk to the landowner so that we could get permissions from them too. And we inquired from a sheikh who was living in a tent at the site, and he said, you know, I can give you permission. This is my tribe that's here. And sure, you can do, we walked up onto the tell and we wandered around the tell, and he said, you can dig anywhere up here except this place right here. There's some graves there. I don't want you digging in our cemetery. So we laid out our plots of ground where we were going to work, and decided that on the day that we would start, and we put a team there, headed up that particular team by a man named Randy Yonker, who now is teaching at Andrews University after he finished his degree. So as he was working there with his crew, up came a Mercedes-Benz, black Mercedes-Benz, rushed right up on top of the mound. Nobody had ever driven onto the mound. There were steep sides, and we said, what is this guy doing? And he gets out of the car, and he all is dressed in Army regalia with the fancy hat and so on. He said, what are you doing here? Well, we're excavating, we're archaeologists. Who gave you permission to do that? Well, the sheikh who lives on the mound said that we could. He doesn't have the right to do that, and he was very upset. Come to find out, he was part of the Jordanian army that was sent to Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. When the government heard that the Bedouin had found caves with scrolls, they said, we have to find out where that is. And so they sent a team from the army down to the area of Qumran to explore and to look for the various caves that might have contained the scrolls. And this man, who had driven up in his Mercedes onto the mound that he actually owned, was the army person in charge of that contingent that went to look for the original caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's another interesting story of our relationship between the Dead Sea Scrolls and our team. And the story continues because we maintained a relationship with that general and his family. And he said, my daughter has always been interested in archaeology. Could she study with you? And she came to Andrews University to get her Ph.D. in archaeology. So isn't that interesting how connected we are, and Adventist archaeologists are, to the whole topic of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's how I got my interest and some of my involvement. So let me just say a few things about the Dead Sea Scrolls in terms of why they are important to us. And then Dr. Bramlett, who's the director of our center at La Sierra University, the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, and also the chair of the Biblical Studies Department in the Divinity School, HMS Divinity School at La Sierra, he's going to give you the full explanation in a way that I won't. So as you've heard us talk, you heard this morning, that wonderful talk in church this morning, and then this afternoon, about the importance of these scrolls that came from caves at a site called Qumran, just overlooking the northwestern end of the Dead Sea. And they're usually dated from around the 3rd century before Christ down to the 1st century. So during the time of Jesus, there were people living at Qumran, writing scrolls and using the scrolls. And there are about 15,000 scrolls and fragments. So we're really talking about quite a large corpus of materials. Every book of the Hebrew Bible is represented in the finds, except for one, and that is Esther. And as you know, the word God does not appear in the book of Esther, and so some people have thought maybe that's the reason that Esther might not be included. Maybe these holy people who are very committed to their form of Judaism thought that Esther doesn't belong, or maybe it's just an accident of discovery that they haven't been found. Of course, there are many copies of, or many specific scrolls, copies of various books, and the one that was favorite of Qumran was the book of Psalms. There are 39 scrolls, remnants of either whole or remnants of 39 different scrolls of the Psalms have been found. Then the next is Deuteronomy. There were 33 of those, so obviously they appreciated that. Genesis, there were 24 copies. Isaiah, 22, including 2 complete scrolls of Isaiah. Amazing that it's all there, all 66 books in one long piece that had been, of course, sewn together. Exodus, there were 18. Leviticus, 17 copies. Numbers, 11. Minor Prophets, 10. Daniel, there are 8 of those. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Job, 6 of each of those. Kings, Samuel, Judges, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, each of those had 4 copies. Ecclesiastes, 2, and Joshua, 2. So that gives you a little feel for the scrolls that they read the most or used the most in their services and in their worship, and so forth. There are only a dozen or so that are complete. Most of these are fragmentary. And the scrolls, many of them are in parchment or in papyrus. There's even one in copper. The writing is mostly in Hebrew, but also in Aramaic and some Greek. They were discovered, as we said, between 1947 and 1956. And it was in 1953, as I mentioned, that I first visited the caves. The present location of most of these scrolls is in the Israel Museum, the Shrine of the Book, and the Jordan Museum in Amman has the copper scroll, and then, as you've heard, sometimes they're loaned out. Some of the pieces, some of the scrolls are loaned out for various exhibits, and you're fortunate in having here in your own church a docent who can take you to see the ones at the Reagan Library. Very rare that Dead Sea Scrolls would come to a place like this. Why are we so excited about these scrolls? Why are they important? Well, before they were found, the oldest copies of the Bible that we had available to us were medieval, 1,000 years after Christ. And people would say, unbelievers would say to believers, how do you know that the Bible that you have is accurate? I mean, they were copied and recopied and copied, probably got all kinds of errors. Maybe things were introduced that really didn't belong to the originals, and believers would just have to say, we trust that God would protect, keep his hand over his word so that it continues to be accurate. But we had no way of proving that until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. All of a sudden, we had copies of biblical books that were 1,000 years earlier than we previously had. And so now we have, through the Dead Sea Scrolls, copies of all these books of the Old Testament, which are essentially the same as what we have today. Sometimes there are a few copyist errors here and there, but they're not theologically important, they're not historically important. They're just interesting to scholars who want to make sure that all the spelling is correct and so forth. So it's a marvelous thing to have found in the field these scrolls that existed in the time of Jesus. And so the Bible that Jesus used, we have copies of that. And we have confidence that what was preserved was what the authors intended. Who did this kind of work? The most popular theory is it was a sect of Judaism called the Essenes, people who didn't like the Pharisees and didn't like the Sadducees and were unhappy with what they were doing up in Jerusalem. They wanted to purify Judaism, and so they had their own little community down there by the Dead Sea where they wouldn't be bothered and where they could just work on their scrolls and study the scriptures and so forth. So now, if you're interested, you can go to the publication of the Hebrew University and get all the scrolls and study them to your heart's content. We're so fortunate at La Sierra University to have Dr. Bramlett, who, as you've heard, received his Ph.D. at the University of Toronto in Canada, one of the eminent universities for this particular kind of work. And this man can teach any Near Eastern language that you would like to study, not only Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, but if you want Egyptian, or if you want Babylonian, or Assyrian, or Syriac, you can sign up to take those languages with him. Very busy man. Not only is he directing a project in Jordan, but chairing the Department of Biblical Studies at La Sierra. But as you've heard, he's the director of our center, which I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about. And in our question and answer period, we'll be glad to answer questions about the center and even how you might be able to visit and to support our work. But I think that are you going to introduce our next speaker? Great, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Geraty. By the way, we have Dr. Bramlett brought some newsletters from La Sierra of the Archaeology Institute there and what they're doing. And even for those of you, if there's anyone in the audience that wants to go on and become an archaeologist, they have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in archaeology. You can look at some of the literature back there. I'll tell you my story about Siegfried Horn. You know, when I was doing my undergraduate, I used to always want to be an archaeologist, but I ended up studying foods and nutrition. And when I did my undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Science degree in Foods and Nutrition at Pacific Union College, which is up in the Nampa Valley. It's one of our Seventh-day Adventist colleges. As a Christian school, we were required to take so many Bible classes, and I took biblical archaeology. I was so fascinated with biblical archaeology. I took the full year of courses. Dr. Paul Bork was the professor there. And I learned about Siegfried Horn through that, and I thought, boy, someday I'd love to meet Siegfried Horn. And it's interesting, when I was taking the archaeology class, I sat down once with the head of the Department of Religion at Pacific Union College, and he was looking, he says, why are you taking all these classes in archaeology? He thought I should take some other biblical classes. And I said, well, I'm interested. That's why. So years later, I was a member of the Pleasant Hill Seventh-day Adventist Church in Northern California. And I'd always, there'd be many members in there, and sometimes I'd sit next to this older man, and sometimes I'd see him at a distance and all that, and I never knew who he really was. And then one day in church, here I wanted to meet Siegfried Horn. The pastor announced, we're very sad that Dr. Siegfried Horn had just passed away. And he always sat over there, and I thought, what? I could have met him personally. So that's why it's important, when you're in church, get to know everyone in your congregation. You never know who you will meet. Well, our next speaker is Dr. Kent Bramlett, and you heard a little bit about his background, but he's a professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity at La Sierra University. He is chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology and the director of graduate studies in archaeology. He is a curator of the archaeology collections, and I think we see some of the collections over here that he'll be sharing with us today, and director of the Lawrence T. Geraty and Douglas R. Clark Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, so named after Dr. Geraty here. Previously, and by the way, he got his Ph.D. degree in Near Eastern Archaeology at University of Toronto. Previously, he earned an undergraduate degree at Walla Walla University. I think we have some graduates in here from there. And then he got an MA degree at Andrews University. At La Sierra, he teaches hieroglyphic Egyptian. That's pretty hard to read. Sumerian and Hebrew, in addition to a variety of other archaeology classes. Kent is currently involved in the application of technology and archaeological research using many different types of technologies. You're going to see some of those that they're going to go to the Reagan Library tomorrow, what they're doing with the technology and AI and how to read some of these scrolls and so forth. In addition to excavating in Turkey and Jordan, studying at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and living for 6 months at a kibbutz in Mount Carmel foothills of Israel, he enjoys traveling and backpacking in more than 60 different countries and all these interesting historical sites. So let's welcome Dr. Kent Bramlett.
Thank you. We'll see if this microphone is picking up all right. I put it on myself, so I'm not sure if it'll work. Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction. And I would say, really take note of Dr. Geraty's stories. It's a generation that he's had contact with that's mostly past. These are sort of the foundational figures of biblical archaeology: Father de Vaux, Père de Vaux, Frank Cross, certainly Siegfried Horn, and some of these other people. So these are first-hand accounts from someone who knew these founding figures. And I have felt privileged to be able to work with Dr. Geraty for over several years myself. Well, let's take a further look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think I can move things along here. Yeah, I'll probably be turning around quite a bit so I can see what we're looking at. There's a screen there, but it's fairly far away. Okay, so let's talk about the timeline a little bit, because this is really important to following the story of the wider recognition of the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their long process of translation. And this actually turned into a scandal for a few decades. Why can't everybody access the Dead Sea Scrolls? What did they say? Who's hiding them? Well, nobody was really hiding them, but professors take a long time sometimes in their research and want to have it right before they publish it. So the timeline. When did those two shepherd boys, the Bedouin boys, find cave 1? It's called cave 1. So the one guy, pretty well confirmed, his name was Muhammad Adib. Adib is like the term for wolf in Arabic, so probably his nickname, Muhammad the Wolf. He's out with his cousin in the Judean desert. I'll show you the geography in just a minute, but it's important to know that these Bedouin move up and down. Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level, and then you have the Rift Valley drops down to 1,300 or so feet below sea level at Qumran. So that's a 4,000 foot elevation gain. You can actually follow, the shepherds did, that would follow the seasons, providing greenery or at least scrub brush for their sheep and their goats to eat. So they would sort of migrate up and down that elevation pattern from summer to winter. So these two boys are down there probably early in 1947, some would argue even perhaps in later 1946. The news of this didn't reach the wider world for quite a while yet. But sometime in 1947, Muhammad Adib throws this rock in the cave, here's breaking pottery, and they scramble up there and find broken pottery with these old rolls of parchment stuff, vellum, leather scraps inside. And they take a few of the scrolls back to the Bedouin tents, their family. They discuss whether this is important or not, whether to show the wider, to even keep them. They hang them from the tent poles apparently, and they go back and explore some of the caves, maybe find a few more. There are 7 scrolls that originally come from cave 1 that we'll talk about. This is in 1947 probably. Eventually they go up to Bethlehem. This is kind of the center for a lot of the Bedouin community to buy and sell their products from their wool from the sheep, cheese that's been consolidated from the goat milk, etc., and buy other supplies. So they go up there and they talk to several antiquities dealers. The story gets really convoluted, and all these sort of oral histories don't always agree with each other, but at least they talk to one antiquities dealer named Kondo. That was his nickname. Everybody knows Kondo. You've met Kondo, right? Right. And some of the scrolls stay there. The Israeli war, the Israeli-Arab war, the Israelis call it the War of Independence, happens in May 1948. And this is where things really complicate the discovery of the scrolls. Because we have a war going on and then a division between what becomes the initial state of Israel and the state of Jordan and what are now known as, of course, the Arab territories, right? The West Bank, the Jordanian Legion secures that territory. That becomes part of Jordan. So the West Bank is part of Jordan until 1967 in the Six-Day War. The Gaza Strip is occupied by Egypt. Palestinians don't get any of these. It's just other surrounding countries that control them at that point. And the area of Qumran then falls under what we call the West Bank, which is then governed by Jordan. So the Dead Sea Scroll search that continues, and the excavations that Father de Vaux leads are executed by people living in Jordan or Jordan-controlled territory. East Jerusalem is part of Jordan at that point then. We can say for sure that there's an announcement in fall of 1948, end of 1948, there's an announcement by ASOR, the American Schools of Oriental Research, now called the American Society of Overseas Research. Dr. Geraty was president of the society for a number of years. It's the group of scholars, foreign scholars, that work in the Holy Land, right? Announcement was made that these important scrolls have been found, but we still don't really have wide access to them by the general public. January, I think, of 1949 was when the Jordanian general that Dr. Geraty mentioned, led a further expedition searching, along with Lancaster Harding, who was the British Jordanian head of the Antiquities Department at that time. You see here in the screen this little cutout from the Wall Street Journal over here. And this occurs somewhat later. This is in 1954. This newspaper ad, let me just read it to you. It says, 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back at least to 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. And then it has a box number you can write to. Yigal Yadin, the famous Israeli general, his father, his last name was Sukenik, before a family name change, saw this ad in the paper and had no idea what it was about. So he investigated, and this is where the Israel Museum then eventually acquired the original scrolls, including the 4 that were advertised here. So this is 1954. By this time, the excavations are beginning, but let's proceed then. And you can see, though, that the early timeline is a difficult one to trace out, and that the broader awareness only happens over a period of years. So I'm going to show a few pictures of the site of Qumran and talk about interpretations of that site, why it's important, why do we even connect it with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They weren't found in the ruins. And then we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. What are some of the types of documents, including biblical books, where did they come from, who wrote them, etc. The settlement. Okay. When the scrolls turned up and additional caves were found with more scrolls, most of them were very adjacent to this ruin called a khirbat in Arabic, khirbat Qumran, the ruins of Qumran. It's not an ancient site, but it's simply the Arabic Bedouin term for this ruin. Clearly, when the caves are found with scrolls, people begin to look around what site might be associated with the production and the hiding of these scrolls. So immediately or quite quickly, Qumran became the focus of archaeological research. The location is important to understand why the scrolls were preserved. Everybody knows mummies and papyri are preserved in Egypt, right? You wouldn't even really have to mummify an individual to preserve them in the Egyptian desert. You put them in a tomb and it just sort of happens naturally. You have a lot of natural mummification of wild animal, or they crawl into a tomb, a cat or something. And of course, the later process perfected that process. Most of ancient Israel is Mediterranean climate like this. It rains and materials decay. But if you look at the map here, you can see that we have all of these zones beginning with the Mediterranean Sea here, the green coastal plain, a very lush region, sort of the yellow foothills, the Piedmont or foothills of Israel, and then the brown highlands. This is elevational, not rainfall pattern. And as I mentioned, Jerusalem is 2,500 feet high, so think about these weather systems coming in from the Mediterranean. They get pushed up the mountains. Rain precipitates out as the clouds cool, right? And right at Jerusalem, which is at the top, at the height of these hills, right up here, just about across from the top of the Dead Sea, you then start to descend. And this is then a rain shadow. The air warms, it holds any remaining moisture, and you have a desert. This is the Judean desert. And it drops way down, as we mentioned. It's the Rift Valley. I'll show you a map in just a minute. These are cutaways of along basically a slice through here. And then the Dead Sea, as the pastor mentioned this morning, is the lowest place on earth above water level, right? It's 1,300 feet below sea level. Now it's more like 1,400 feet below sea level because, well, people pump too much fresh water out of the Jordan River before it replenishes the Dead Sea, which is a dead end, and it just evaporates. And all the minerals and the salts concentrate there. So we're in a desert. It's very much like in Egypt. Anything will be preserved if it's protected from the basic elements of erosion and the occasional storm. And indeed, this is a very dry area. Here's a picture looking out across the southern Arava Valley. The Rift Valley is that geological fault that begins in Mozambique, way down here in Africa, southern East Africa, and then up through Tanzania, Kenya, the Red Sea, and it angles up towards Turkey, separating what's now the areas of Israel and Jordan, up through the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, between the two ranges of the Lebanon mountains, and is an area where the tectonic plates have shifted and an area has dropped down low. So you have escarpments on two sides and kind of a flat bottom area. We take a look at exactly where Qumran is. As Larry said, it's at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, not right on the water, but about a kilometer or so away from the water. And Jerusalem would be up here. Let's go in a little closer. You probably could see better there. Here is Jerusalem. And you can see there's a road going down here. This is to Jericho, the Jericho Road. You may know the song, right, on the Jericho Road. This is where, of course, the Good Samaritan aided the wounded man that Jesus told the story about. If you head a little bit further south, there's a cutoff route here. You get at Qumran, which is what? That exactly is the question. So here is a view looking down from the Judean desert, very dry area at the Dead Sea. You can see the rugged terrain. It's distant and close in many ways to Jerusalem. It's a day's journey down the road, but it's very far in terms of social interaction, right? It's an area you could pull away from everyday life. And of course, this has often been connected with the idea of the Essenes. And so let's talk about those people. Let's just frame that just very briefly. In Jesus' time, we have what we call Second Temple Judaism. Judaism isn't sort of this uniform religious practice, but you have these different sects. And that's not a derogatory term, that just means sectarian. It's a group within a larger community. So you have the Sadducees. Famously, they control the temple, right, in Jesus' time. They're the priests. You have the Pharisees. This is kind of a lay movement, people who are making the argument that all Jewish people can actually keep the law. In the previous few centuries, that really hadn't been the general consensus. In Jerusalem, they observed the law of ritual purity, but up in the villages in Nazareth and in the countryside, what's the possibility of keeping the Mosaic law? The Pharisees argued and provided famously a bunch of interpretations of the law, right? 614 regulations later on when it's codified, which initially were an attempt to make the practice of fulfilling the law accessible. Okay, that was their argument. Then we have the Zealots, who are sort of this religious, political movement, mostly focused on opposition to Rome. And then in the Bible, complete silence about another prominent group that we know from other sources like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, the Essenes. There's a lot of debate about what the name means, but probably coming from a word meaning pious or something like that. The Essenes had a great disagreement with the way things were being run in Jerusalem. They focused a lot on purity. Let me just give you one quick example. There was if you ask the regulators in Jerusalem, okay, you know the idea of ritual purity, right? It's not like wash your hands and be clean, but it's a process to separate yourself from the everyday world of messiness and to enter into sort of a holiness connection with heaven. So in Jerusalem, among the Sadducean regulations, if you have a vessel, a pottery vessel that is full of water, and for whatever reason it's ritually unclean, maybe the person touched it who had recently touched a carcass or something like that. Now, if a ritually pure person, and you needed to be, if you were a priest to go serve in the temple, you needed to be pure. If you had a vessel of water and you had excess and it's ritually clean, and you pour it into this ritually unclean vessel, will the ritual impurity follow that stream of water that is temporarily connecting the two vessels and make the one you're holding unclean? In Jerusalem, they said, no, it won't. But the Essenes were like, yes, it will. You up in Jerusalem are doing it all wrong. The fact is you're not even ritually clean when you're going into the temple. Okay? In a nutshell, that sort of captures one of many arguments they had, but they were very concerned with ritual purity. And one of the scrolls that was found is about rebuilding a temple and how it would be completely ritually clean. The Essenes would wash before and ritually clean themselves before every meal, fully ritually clean, so that if the Messiah were to come during that interlude, they would be ready for the Messiah. And this brings up the question, what is the connection with John the Baptist? You know, I'm kind of two minds in that regard. There are a lot who feel there are connections between the movement of John the Baptist and this Essene community. I would argue there are some strong points there. In fact, is when Jesus sends his disciples into the city of Jerusalem during the last week, right? He says, follow those guys with the water pots in their heads, and they'll lead you and tell them we want to rent the upper room for what becomes the Last Supper. That seems to happen in what's been called the Essene Quarter, as Josephus describes the sectors of the city. So maybe the sympathizers, or those that are most sympathetic to Jesus and his message, are Essenes. But there are strong differences in terms of ritual interpretation, right? Jesus is not focused on ritual regulations, and the Essenes were. So yeah, there's some give and take in that regard. So this is a background to who perhaps the Essenes were, and we'll talk about whether they were at Qumran or not. Here is a plan. So Father de Vaux at the École Biblique leads an excavation between 1951, I think, and 56 or so, about over 5 years. And during that time, you were there, right, Dr. Geraty? And saw the ongoing work. And this is what they produced. The ruins, the hirbe in Arabic, turned out to be, let's go back and look at this plan, some sort of compound with water channels coming into it, a lot of cisterns, and you would need that in the desert, and also a lot of ritual baths for purity, we'll see in just a minute, and a few rooms that de Vaux interpreted as important to the identification of the group that lived here, that inhabited the place. One of these is this is room 6 over here. Different maps have different numbers, so don't worry about memorizing those. But room 6 on this one is what he called the scrollery and the scriptorium. And this is where he found broken benches. I'll show you pictures in just a minute. And he thought this is where the Essenes were copying the Dead Sea Scrolls. 8 down here is the sort of hall of congregation, or even the dining hall. And there's a pantry off here which had hundreds and hundreds of simple bowls, not fancy bowls. Let's go to this one, and it shows a highlight with water features, storage facilities, and I think we have to rotate here about a quarter turn, but in here would be where that potential scrollery was located. And that is the archaeological site before the modern tourist walkways were built over it. If you visit now, you'll have sort of air bridges and viewing platforms and other access points to see the site. That's a very typical archaeological site. The lower levels were preserved by what collapsed in from upper levels, right? So you're basically excavating wall lines and floor surfaces, and then you need to reconstruct activity in those rooms based on the artifacts and the pieces and things you find in those areas. Okay, we mentioned water features. So a mikveh is a Jewish ritual bath. And according to the regulations for this, which are codified after the time of Jesus, we know that it needed to have water enough that a person could dip into it. So I think the amount of water would be equivalent to about 60 gallons. Think in terms of a 55-gallon drum of water. It could be quite small, but enough to dunk down into. And then you would have steps going down into it, and a couple of other things are important. Many times there'll be a dividing line on the steps. You go down on the right side, cleanse, and come up on the opposite side. Not always. But another feature that is important is that there's a water channel with water flowing into it, at least temporarily. This is called living water, mayim chai. Living water was interpreted as being flowing water. And so you would have a reservoir. You could pour a jug of water into it, just a small amount. It would trickle down through the channel, go into the pool reservoir, and it would become then suitable for ritual cleansing. So a mikveh can be very small, or it could be much larger for a group of people. And this is where you can sometimes have arguments. Is it actually a big cistern with steps going down just to store water? Almost certainly the small ones would not be very functional as cisterns, but the large ones perhaps could be either. Qumran has a number of cisterns, and how do you get water storage at a desert site like this? Well, it's on the edge of a wadi, or a gulch, that flows when there are rainstorms up in the hills. And what the Essenes, or the occupants of the site, did, they went up to where the elevation is higher than their site, made a dam across the ravine, and a channel then that would flow when there's a storm and would bring water through flowing down through their channel, and then would fill the water cisterns at the site. And of course, most of the rushing torrent would still run down the stream out to the Dead Sea. So it's a very clever way of providing water. and you would have to make sure you get all the water when there is a storm coming down. And these storms can be tremendous. You hear once in a while in the news, either the Israeli side or the Jordanian side, there's sometimes disastrous accidents where groups will get caught in a flash flood. It's happened on both sides. Not too many years ago, an Israeli group got washed away. And more recently, even on the Jordanian side, a school group of Jordanian kids, some of whom drowned, were washed in a flash flood. So this is, it's a very real thing. Here's the aqueduct that comes down out of the hillside that I mentioned, and it brings then water through the channels to store in the water cisterns. So here's a large cistern and or mikveh. Again, sometimes there's debate on some of the larger ones. But it is evident that ritual purity is a significant concern. This would be an argument for identifying the occupants here as Essenes, a group of, as de Vaux would argue, he could relate to them living in a monastic or a religious order. He would recognize some of those communal aspects. Here's the scriptorium, the room that we pointed out earlier on the top plan, but it's actually this one back over here. This is sort of courtyard area, but that's the famous scriptorium. And let's move forward. And here are those plaster benches that de Vaux argued were writing benches for scribes. They probably didn't sit on these. Most scribes depicted in antiquity are standing writing. So you can imagine if this is the case, and it is still accepted as a possible interpretation. We don't really have a good explanation for what else they would be. They're not terribly strong, so probably not for sitting. But you can imagine, say, the great Isaiah scroll laid out on this. The scribes are making copies. There's some more fragments. These are in the Jordan Museum in Amman because they were excavated during the time of the Jordanian control of the West Bank. An inkwell. The ink actually has been tested. There are several inkwells were found at Qumran, and one or more has been tested, and the ink has actually matched with some of the ink on the Dead Sea Scroll fragments. That's an argument that at least some of the scrolls were written at the site of Qumran. I think that's a very significant connection. And here is one of the scroll jars, broken but reconstructed. Most of them are about 9 inches in diameter, so not like a big, water or grain storage jar, but a fairly narrow one, long enough you could wrap the scrolls in them, insert them, and then sort of this makeshift lid. These lids are quite unique. The Israel Museum's exhibit of the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Shrine of the Book. It's part of the Israel Museum. The roof, as you approach it, you can see is this big white thing. It's modeled on the lids of these scroll jars. It's almost the same. Okay, if you go to Qumran, and how many here have been to Qumran? I know that some of you have. Oh yeah, a whole bunch. So I'm sure all of you, do it again raise your hands again. Yeah, look at that. It's a lot of people here. This is bringing very familiar. You know Cave 4 because you go across from the site, and then you look down into the wadi in Cave 4. What you might not know is that 7, 8, and 9 are sort of just down the escarpment as well, and then actually 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all fairly close around Qumran. 1, 2, and 3, and 11 are further away. But that proximity is what led Roman de Vaux and others to argue that indeed the scrolls came from the site of Qumran. And that's where I want to talk about the function of Qumran. Not everybody agrees that there was a group of religious ascetics living at this site, kind of like you think of the medieval monasteries, right? This sort of this daily life routine, copying the scripture and practicing your religious orders, rituals. Not everybody agreed. So let me, I can't see on the back screen there, let me just turn around over here. The first one I have listed there is Roman de Vaux' own argument, and this is called the Essene hypothesis. We've already covered that pretty much, that it's Essenes who live there, and they are the ones responsible for writing the scrolls, copying the scrolls, and in some cases, like the great Isaiah scroll, which dates to the 3rd century at least BC, they would have probably purchased them or acquired them and brought them there as part of their library of scripture. So that's the Essene hypothesis. In the 1990s, well, Roman de Vaux, I believe, died in 1971. And he, as some archaeologists do, didn't have a final publication series out yet on his work. And that left his detailed notes unpublished. In the early 1990s, the École Biblique, so his institution there in Jerusalem, asked a Belgian archaeological couple, actually the Donseals, a married couple who are archaeologists, to work through those notes and publish them. And they came out with an argument that this Qumran actually wasn't a site where Essenes lived. It was rather a villa rustica, as they called it, a rural estate of some wealthy individual. And there are these rural estates around the Roman world, and including in Israel, Palestine. This caused a whole furor, and then there were a bunch of more arguments. Others argued, Crown and Cairnsdale argued, no, it's not a villa rustica, it's a entrepot, a way station for trade. And they made a big argument about the scrolls weren't from there, they were brought down from Jerusalem. Others, Norman Golb was another Dead Sea Scroll individual. He argued that it was a Hasmonean fortress from the centuries before. So a Jewish, during the independent kingdom preceding the Roman occupation. This was actually Norman Golb. This is a funny story. His son, when I was in grad school, impersonated apparently some other scholars, pretending to be other famous scholars in support of his father's idea, and he eventually was jailed for a while. So this tells you the level of investment and the depth of argument going on for a while. I think it's simmered down quite a bit now. And most are coming back to the idea that indeed it seems to have connections with the scrolls, like the ink studies I mentioned, even some clay lumps that were found in the ruins of Qumran are identified through neutron activation analysis. You can look at the different elements present in that clay, sort of give it a element reading, and it matches some of the scroll jars which were found up in, I think, Cave 11, or maybe even Cave 1. And so there are these connections we can make back and forth and enough. And perhaps Qumran was begun at an earlier time as a fortress, right? And then repurposed by this community to make it their center of retreat or of wilderness living. That's a possibility. So these are some of the arguments that we've had about Qumran. And that's just a diagram. And I won't linger on this, but looking at the archaeological level. So there's always a lot of detail involved in arguments, archaeological arguments. And different layers, there was an earthquake in about 31 BC. So there's a destruction layer at 31 BC. Who lived there before? Who rebuilt it afterwards? Pretty much everybody now, most people now would argue that it was the Essenes, at least after, maybe before as well, at some point coming to that site and occupying it. You know, there's some have even argued that the scrolls include some of the Jerusalem library brought down before the Romans, during the Roman revolt, before the Romans conquered the country. So there's a lot of nuance to these arguments. We can get to that. But let's go to the scrolls now and talk about a few of those questions. Now that we've established, at least I think we can say the scrolls have a connection with the site of Qumran. De Vaux's intuition back in the 1950s, I think, was well-founded. Okay, here's a map of the scroll caves. Most of them, as we said, are around this site of Qumran. Here's a zoom in, but we have Cave 11 and 1 and 2 and 3 up further up the coastline. And Jericho would be just up a little bit higher. Actually, it's right there. It's an oasis, desert oasis. So great citrus fruit grows at Jericho nowadays. And it was a winter retreat for people up in Jerusalem. Certainly Herod, for example, in the time of Jesus, had a palace at Jericho because when it's cold in Jerusalem in the winter, and it snows occasionally, but it can be wet and very just cold and bone-chilling in the wintertime. So you go down to Jericho, and it's this like Palm Springs area, a desert oasis. And he had a palace down there. It's actually where he died later. Here's a picture of circling some of the additional caves. Cave 4 is there that you would recognize if you've been there. But then if you were to continue towards the Dead Sea along that escarpment, they're not visible from on top, but you'd have some of those additional caves that were excavated around 1952, I believe. Cave 1 was really exciting, the one the Bedouins found, because these 7 nearly intact, well, fairly intact scrolls. The Isaiah scroll is fantastic, all of the book of Isaiah, and it's probably the most famous one. The terminologies for the scrolls, you have first a number. This represents which cave it was found in, 1, 2, 3 through 11. And now you know there was a 12th cave, but nothing was intact. There was some unwritten on vellum and broken pottery and a pick. So we know it had been looted probably back in the 1950s. But 11 caves with scrolls or scroll fragments. And you have the number of the scroll, and then you have the letter Q for Qumran, and then you have some sort of abbreviation for the name of the book, Isaiah. And then if there's more than one from that cave of that particular book, you would have a numeration for it. So 1Q, Isaiah A. So cave 1 of Qumran, the book of Isaiah, copy A, the first copy. That's the great scroll. That was really exciting. And it's nearly the same as our Isaiah in the Bible today. Dr. Geraty mentioned that there's a strong similarity in the texts. There's maybe minor changes in words or well, there's no punctuation, but in minor things that we would consider inconsequential like that. And very few larger textual differences. Other of these large scrolls, we have the community rule. This is what appears to be a text regulating the life of the community at Qumran, describing the purity regulations, the yachad, or the group that lives there. A pesher on Habakkuk, or pesher Habakkuk, that's a commentary on the book of Habakkuk. Commentaries are really exciting because they tell you how these people are reading a particular biblical book, right? Imagine a commentary, of course, from our time would be very different from a commentary by a group in the time of Jesus. But it indicates their senses as they come to a biblical book and how they're looking at it. So commentaries are really exciting. The war scroll, I'll end on that later. We'll come back to that. But this was the sort of the millennial or eschatological expectation of this group, that the times would end in a great conflict between light and darkness. The Thanksgiving hymns, a series of hymns probably for ritual worship, and then the Genesis Apocryphon, another one. Okay, there's just some pictures, but let's, you can see some are more complete and some have lost due to the storage conditions. The ones in the scroll jars are much better preserved than those not in scroll jars. Cave 4, which is the closest really to the site of Qumran, had thousands of fragments, maybe more than 15,000 or so fragments. No scroll jars. So you can imagine this community. The Romans are coming, but we have time. They're carefully rolling them and packing them in jars and hiding them off in distant caves. It's getting closer and closer. They still have their library. They grab armfuls of scrolls and just basically dump them in Cave 4, and so the preservation is very minimal, and we have little pieces and fragments they have to pack back together, piece back together. There are probably 800 to 900 different scrolls represented through all the caves and all the pieces as best we can tell. So that was quite a library at that time, nearly 1,000 scrolls. And now let's just mention the categories. So we have biblical books, of course. About 40% of the scrolls are biblical books or copies of biblical books, except for Esther. Everyone is represented, right? And then another 30% or so are what we call pseudepigraphical, or apocrypha perhaps is the colloquial term, which are really deuterocanonical, or sort of a second canon. They're not in our Western Bible. Some of the books are in other Christian Bibles, like the Greek Orthodox, or especially what are sometimes called the Oriental Orthodoxes, but that's like the Coptic or the Ethiopian Bibles. And then some of them we just didn't even know about. They're even different. But again, very interesting because they represent sort of a teaching tradition of oftentimes a biblical figure and are written in the name of that person, although they weren't really from an earlier time period. So this is literature from the Second Temple period, or the intertestamental period, after the end of the Old Testament. And then the third category, about 30%, is what we would call sectarian. That is, special works that seem to relate to a particular group, the Essenes perhaps at Qumran, if we can identify them as such, like that community rule. scroll that we mentioned just a bit ago. Dr. Geraty mentioned the numbers of different books. I call it a popularity index. And let's, again, just review the top 5. Remember, Psalms was, the book of Psalms is the most popular. My list, these lists vary, again, depending on which fragments you're looking at, but maybe about 39, almost 40. Deuteronomy is second popular with maybe 33 copies. Enoch, I missed a tab there, but there's 25 copies for the book of Enoch. That's one of those books not in the Western canon or Bible, but it is well known and very popular in other groups. And then Genesis. Well, Isaiah, if we go with 6, Isaiah. But let's do one more step. Let's compare it with other contemporary popularity indexes. We don't, the New Testament. Let's just say we can get some sense of what early Christians were reading by the number of times they quote an Old Testament passage from a given book. So that's where we'll go. Psalms, or parts of Psalms, are quoted 79 times in the New Testament. So I would call that the first most popular book. But it's very close to Isaiah, which has 66 references. Think of book of Matthew, right? A lot of them in Matthew. Deuteronomy, then, with 54 references. Exodus, and Enoch, surprisingly, which isn't even in our Bible, but the early Christians clearly valued it a lot. So that's the 5 most commonly quoted Old Testament Hebrew books in the New Testament. The Mishnah is what, okay, so after the temple is destroyed, Second Temple Judaism is in an emergency, it's in a crisis, because the temple no longer exists. How do we worship? They would ask as Jewish people without a temple. And you could go different directions. But the Pharisaic sect, remember, the Sadducees no longer have a temple, they kind of wither away. Who's going to follow them when they no longer have that hold on power? There's Essenes. We don't really know what happened to the Essenes a whole lot, but no doubt some of them sort of joined the Christian movement. Others would have joined the movement which we're going to trace here through the Pharisees to what becomes rabbinic Judaism. So that's sort of the focus on the rabbinical interpretation of the Torah, or the law, and the focus on being Jewish by observing the ritual law. And so the Mishnah is a compilation from about the 2nd century, late 2nd century perhaps, of rabbinical interpretations of the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah. And we can go there then to see what they were valuing, and look at the top 5 quoted Hebrew Bible books in the Mishnah. 349 quotes from the book of Leviticus. And that's pretty logical, right? Because after all, they are interpreting the Mosaic law. Deuteronomy, likewise, 234. Numbers, 133 quotes. Exodus, 133 also. And Psalms, 41. Those are the top 5. So think of these 2 different communities, the New Testament and the early rabbinic Judaism. And let's put Qumran back in the middle of those and think not which one is really coming from the other, but think about their expectations. What are they looking for? And if we go back, how many of the Qumran top books are related to each? Well, Psalms, Deuteronomy, Enoch, and Genesis. Psalms, Deuteronomy, we don't have, we do have Enoch, so the top 3, and Genesis, that I think just came down below, we missed that, and then Isaiah. So at least about 4, almost 4 of them are closely aligned, right? And with the Mishnah, Psalms, yes, it's 5th. Deuteronomy, yes. Enoch, no. Genesis, Isaiah, no. So there's a closer alignment with the books that were popular at Qumran with the New Testament quotations from the Old Testament. To me, that indicates that there's a serious sort of messianic expectation and interpretation and focus. And this seems to fit with what we know of the Qumran community. Let's move on to the origin of the scrolls then. So we've pretty well stated what I think about these connections. But I would mention a couple of other views. The Essene hypothesis of de Vaux, I find strong support, but maybe with modification. After reading what Josephus, what Philo of Alexandria write about the Essenes, we do know that some of them probably did marry. I think that comes from Pliny the Elder's work. And so they weren't all monastic or celibate monastic, although Philo of Alexandria says they were. Well, we might modify that and say that the group at Qumran was a subgroup of Essenes. Maybe this was, some have argued, a retreat where you could go to purify yourself for a period of a few months. Or maybe this is kind of, I don't know, you want to call it an offshoot or sort of a extra religious element within the Essene movement who are really going to go all out and they live down there. That could be. But I think there is a connection between those groups. Another scholar, Larry Schiffman, has argued that it's the Sadducean library. And he has this argument that it was brought down. Maybe, but I don't think it really accounts for the opposition to the temple service in Jerusalem in the way that we seem to get from the Qumran other scrolls, like the Yachad, and even the temple scroll. So I think that a connection between Qumran and the Essenes is warranted. It may be a subgroup. Probably was an Essene-affiliated group or an offshoot even who were strongly apocalyptic and were concerned with ritual purity. The Dead Sea Scrolls then were most probably a part of their library, and some they would have copied and written there, others they would have simply curated the date older. So let's go to the dating. This is a fun one. If any of you saw the headlines a couple of months ago, they were based on this journal article. This one came out June 4, 2025 in PLOS ONE, an online journal. It's respected. And there are headlines going in most of the media after this came out. And it's interesting because it represents a new carbon-14 dating project that sampled, I think, about 30 of the scroll fragments with modern accelerator mass spectroscopy or AMS C14 dating. You can use tiny, tiny little samples. You don't have to take a scissors out and cut a big chunk out of it. The earliest carbon-14 dating, I put the dates up here, you can't see them, but we're in the early 90s. And you had to use larger samples, so no one wanted to sacrifice a bigger piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But nevertheless, a few samples were tested. And of course, carbon-14 has to be calibrated according to the fluctuations that occur in the carbon-14 ratios in the atmosphere. But nevertheless, this recent one is very interesting. Most of the dates for the Dead Sea Scrolls are derived from what we call paleography, dating of the handwriting of the scrolls. And this was developed by Frank Moore Cross, Dr.Geraty's professor at Harvard. And he was able to trace the developments of handwriting through time, noting changes and then sort of dividing up the differences between those changes and proposing basically over every 50 or 25 or 50 years you could see changes in handwriting. I note here that there has been opposition or questioning of that process. After all, people's handwriting sometimes changes through their lifetime, the same individual. Also, changes don't occur at the same time in the same place. You might have one area that sort of continue, especially before modern communication, right? But some areas might continue that tradition of script that would appear to be archaic in other regions that are more rapidly developing. So this current initiative was very interesting, and used a very precise dating formula or methodology, and those are represented in the red bars, and then in the blue bars are the carbon-14 dating, the radiocarbon. The red is based on Frank Cross's paleography method, and then we also have an AI method which tried to analyze through artificial intelligence and propose its own very precise dating scheme for the different scrolls. So this is a result. And what was surprising is that both the new carbon-14 dating, by the way, when Frank Cross heard the results of the early 90s, he's dead now, but in the early 90s, that it pretty much matched his paleographical analysis. He said, well, that confirms carbon-14. I think it was humorous, mostly humorous, but he was probably also a bit serious because he certainly was pretty confident in his method. But others weren't so convinced. They were like, well, let's think about that. So in the current, it was a surprise because no one really expected to push these dates back earlier. Many expected the dates to be more recent, if anything, and that's not the case. And as the pastor mentioned this morning, the Daniel scroll is particularly interesting because for Adventists, having held out for the early dating of the book, when the general scholarly consensus has placed it around the 160s BC, the date range from this new publication places it very early. Let me just take a look at that again. Well, let's see here. So the manuscript called 4Q Daniel C, so 4Q from the cave number 4, Daniel in the book of copy 4, or copy C, the third copy, is thought to date either in the range of 355 to 285 or possibly 230 to 160. Again, it has to do with the calibration curves. There's sometimes little dips, and you scoot across and see what ranges it would fall into. But notice the latest date possible, 160. That is the, you know, if you take the last 5 years there, you could overlap with the consensus view generally. But it's a pretty tight fit. So that is a very interesting, shall I say, outcome, which keeps open, I would say, the conversation about an early date for the book of Daniel. The copper scroll. Dr. Geraty mentioned the copper scroll. You can see it now in the Amman Museum, the new museum downtown. And this is very interesting because it wasn't written on animal skins, on leather, but it was written on hammered copper plates that were then rolled up. And cut apart, I might add, a couple of decades ago, or 3, in order to try to read it. And they used a very skinny saw blade so as not to destroy much of the text, but, and you can pretty well read it, but that's why it's in pieces. What is the copper scroll? Well, it's a record of hidden treasure. Tons of gold and silver are accounted for in talents by weight at different localities. And it's 64 places are named where the temple treasure is hidden. Again, temple treasure, that's interesting. Again, why would the Essenes know where the temple treasure is, or did someone else bring it down and hide it with the Essenes? We don't really know that, but it does claim that it is the treasure from the temple. And it tends to be very specific. I have text here from the first few lines. In the ruins that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps with the entrance at the east, a distance of 40 cubits, a strong box of silver in its vessels with a weight of 17 talents. 17 talents would be a lot. A talent, what is it, like 60 pounds or something like that. There's different amounts. But think of a big grain of horse feed, or big bag of horse feed or something like that. It's about a talent. So in weight. So that's a lot of gold. And notice how specific it is. 40 steps. Or 40 cubits from the entrance, that's the east entrance. But where's the starting point? That's the problem. If you knew from the code here where to start the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, okay, that's the hard part. If you knew what ruin they were talking about. In other words, it's written for someone that knows the area well at that time. Expectation was they would come back and they would use this to get back to retrieve the treasure. Apparently no one came back. The copper scroll was never retrieved. And that brings me to the end of the Essene community at Qumran. They were a very millennial or apocalyptically expectant group. The war scroll tells about their expectations and their preparations for a final battle between the sons of light against the sons of darkness. They identified as the sons of light. In the war scroll, there are instructions for the different divisions, the weaponry they were to construct. They would even write on the weaponry religious sayings, and then the end of the scroll indicates there will be a victory over the sons of darkness by the sons of light. What was the outcome? Well, the Romans counterattacked due to the Jewish revolt of AD 66. We think about AD 68. It's not 100% sure, but it's the last coinage and stuff we have there. So somewhere in that range, Qumran is utterly and completely destroyed. They had their final battle, but it was the reverse outcome of what they were expecting. And we know that simply by the fact that all of the scrolls, or their library was left intact for 2,000 years. And surely if there had been survivors, they would have come back to retrieve their most precious belongings. So an outcome that they were preparing for, or not preparing for, but a conflict they were preparing for, but which disastrously, it turned out disastrously, I think would be a bit of a warning. Simply, I don't know, simply to be careful in what you are expecting, and your hope. Use all of your senses of reason and try not to get caught up into some of those movements. The Christian community, though, on the other hand, continued to flourish with the remnants. If you know the story, they took Jesus' message in Matthew 24. When you see the signs of the end coming, he talked about not one stone will be left on the other. They fled to Pella, which is also in Jordan. And the Christian community remained there for several hundred years and have flourished. So a very different outcome for that community, and one which, of course, we would connect with. So let me end there. We want to talk more, take questions and answers, and talk about the artifacts.
So if you have any questions, raise your hand. And do you want to tell a little bit about, and then afterwards they can come up and see some of the things that
Sure.
the artifacts.
We have a collection here, like a series of lamps through all biblical times, starting with patriarchal period of Abraham and Isaac, and then down through the period of the Judges, the kingdoms of Israel, New Testament times, even into early Christian Byzantine period. Roman glass, some weaponry. They have arrow or spear points, axe, and then pottery from the Roman period here. This is a cooking pot from the Roman times. We'll want to look at that. We had food, right? So
Yeah.
how would that food have been prepared in Jesus' time?
Okay, so raise your hand if you have a couple of questions. We'll take a few questions right now. Anyone have any questions?
I just wanted to point out.
Oh, here.
When you're getting ready to have something like this, and I know I might be that strange person, but if you look at our little demonstration spot, there is a copper scroll. Do you see it? I went to Lowe's and I found a copper scroll. I want you to know, and I rolled it just so you would know.
Yep,
yes,
right
there
here.
was a copper scroll there.
We worked hard on that. By the way, the Daniel scroll that he mentioned, you'll see some of the Daniel scroll at the Reagan Library currently right now. Okay, anyone have any questions? You must have some questions. Yes, okay, I'm going to do it so everyone can hear.
Really that big? Are the scrolls really that big?
Okay.
I guess you'll see them tomorrow, but the Isaiah scrolls are about that high, wouldn't you say, Larry? Yeah, probably about that high. Sometimes the top edges have decayed off because they were the storage jars, and the top is the most damaged.
Yes,
we have a question over here. Okay. Well, let me get it so we can.
Are these samples at the La Sierra?
Yes.
Are part of La Sierra?
These are all part of our archaeological collection at La Sierra University, which consists of several thousand artifacts, not just pottery, but weaponry, metals, a nice Roman glass collection. We have, a huge variety of materials. We can illustrate any biblical time period.
Now, you have a museum there, or you're working on this museum?
We're working on the museum. Dr. Geraty has been leading that initiative.
So when's that going to be open?
It depends on who in the audience will help us.
Okay, if you want to help the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra, we have some newsletters in the back if you'd like to take it. And also, if you know someone that wants to go on and get their bachelor's degree and master's degree there, you can sign up for that too. But there's an address here, and you can go online and support and make a donation to help support the further work of this, so that the museum can get open sometime. We can all say it. What about?
Let me
Want
just
to
say
get
about
up
the
here? If you have any
newsletter.
questions? Want to get up here too?
Yeah, come on up. Let me just say about the newsletter. We put it out 4 times a year, twice in digital copy and twice in print. But you can email us and get on the mailing list or email list so you can receive our information.
So we can be very proud as a Seventh-day Adventist church that we're leaders in this field. At La Sierra and then also at Andrews University, the work going on there. So any other questions? Is there any questions? Yes, you have a question. Let me get the microphone so everyone can hear it.
Can you talk more about what happened to Qumran at the end? The Romans didn't come to Qumran. Was there any battle? But the people died. So how did they do? I don't know if you know. But like, what happened at the end? People died. Nobody came to take the scrolls. So somehow all the people died. But they didn't get destroyed. So the Romans didn't come there. So what do you think happened at the end?
Yeah, the scrolls were hidden in the caves. So when the Romans came, they killed all the people. They attacked the site and knocked it down. And because nobody retrieved the scrolls, we think that all of the people there died or weren't able to come back, certainly. The Roman army was trying to put down a Jewish revolt. So the Romans had administrated that region after 63 BC. Roman general had entered the area, claimed it as part of the Roman territory, and that never went over well with the Jewish people. A minority led a revolt in AD 66. If you'd taken a vote, most of the Jewish community would not have voted for a revolt. But they forced the revolt upon the rest of the people, if you read Josephus, and the Romans came to put down the revolt, and over a period of 4 years mostly, 3 years mopping up later, but in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. So that's the complete. Somewhere in that range, Qumran was, between 66 and 70, Qumran was destroyed. We don't know exactly, but guessing maybe around 68 AD. And the Romans were very thorough in their work. When they put down a revolt, they would leave no opposition. And in Jerusalem, they made a siege around the whole city until they were able to breach the walls.
You have another question? Okay, wait, let me get it so everyone can hear you.
I have a question, because I know that as the Dead Sea Scrolls became popularized and people were doing that treasure hunt kind of thing, there were private collectors that got these. Have any of those people come forward in this? I mean, I've always wondered, did anybody say, hey, I was one of those people that got a private collection thing and I should send these to the scholars so they can now decode it? But has any of that kind of thing happened at all?
There are fragments that are in private collections. Most of them we think we know about. There could always be surprises. There is actually one unknown Dead Sea Scroll in a bank vault in Switzerland, along with a box of scraps. Emmanuel Tove himself told me that personally. And so there are still surprises. But they wanted $20 million for the scroll, and nobody was willing to pay that.
Okay, we have a question back here. Did you have a question right here? Okay.
Doctor, the debate has been raging for years about the earlier late writing of the Book of Daniel. Did this recent dating that you've just discussed, has that changed the argument at all? I know there's a quote from Josephus saying that Alexander was given a copy of the Book of Daniel, or was shown a copy of the Book of Daniel during that reign. Does this dating method that you've just discussed today, does that give any validity to Josephus' comment, you think?
That's interesting, and it's too early to tell. It's only been 2 months since the research was published. What it might do, and I'm just guessing, is acknowledge at least a core of the book that would be earlier. I think probably many would still hold that the chapters 9, 10, 11, or 10, 11, 12 date from the 160s. I think that would be hard to move the popular consensus. But it may shift to an acknowledgement of that there's a core set of stories that date earlier. But I find it fascinating, certainly for the Adventist interpretation, that it does reopen this conversation in a significant way.
Thank you for the wealth of information. My question is there a version of scrolls for the New Testament that is complete? And if so, where are they and what are they called?
Well, so our most complete set of the Hebrew Bible, certainly before the Dead Sea Scrolls, was from about 800, right? The Masoretic texts, the Aleppo Codex, the Sinaitic, well, not the Sinaitic, the Aleppo Codex in Hebrew, and the Leningrad Codex. For the New Testament manuscripts, we're going back 400s. We have fragments, 2nd century, maybe the 2nd century. Yeah, where is the equivalent of the Qumran collection? In the sands of Egypt, maybe. We had the Nag Hammadi finds there, which were mostly Gnostic texts because they were eventually sort of condemned by orthodoxy, so they were hidden away and buried. But there's always the possibility that there'll be more manuscripts that are found. Right now, the most promising finds are coming from multispectral analysis of existing manuscripts, of using different frequencies of light and high technology to see earlier versions that were often religious texts that were scraped off in medieval times to reuse the material and write a later book. And so, for example, the library at Mount Sinai, Santa Katrina, library is being analyzed this way. And a number of these, they're called palimpsests, it's a Greek word meaning written over again, are being identified. And sometimes they're Greek classical texts or Latin, I'd love to find, some of the lost histories of the Romans, or more of, Archimedes' text, I think, was one of these that turned up in a palimpsest. So yeah, the possibility of going back through medieval libraries is a very promising one.
I had a question. I didn't think you mentioned it. Can you tell us about the Ten Commandment scroll?
Do you know specifically?
You're talking about the one.
I
think the Reagan Library had the Ten Commandments there. Yeah, I don't know much about.
Well, that's the oldest scroll that has the full Ten Commandments on it by 1,000 years. We had it at the Reagan Library. It was just shown for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So we had 21,000 people come to see that.
Wow.
Okay, another question. Okay. Oh, yes, one of our docents at the Reagan Library.
There is a very interesting exhibit at the Reagan Library, which is the Masada Massacre. Would you be able to enlighten us? Were the essence the ones who were occupying it before the Roman just exterminated them? That's the reason. Is that the reason why the essence basically just disappeared?
The story of Masada is interesting as well. And we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them come from these caves, but there's a few other sources down by En-Gedi, another cave, Murabat, Cave of Treasure, Nachal Haver. These are also basically along the ravines that go down. There's cave systems in them. And any of these could hold undiscovered archives, although there's been a recent Israeli initiative with the army to do even ground-penetrating radar to find any other unknown caves. And they haven't been overly successful. As far as Masada goes, and there are some fragments that are almost classed with the Dead Sea Scrolls from the same time period from Masada. And no, those weren't the Essenes, they were the Zealots that held out there. And Masada was put down. It was one of those mopping up operations I mentioned that extended the Roman campaign. That was in 73, so that's 3 years after the Romans were pretty much done. And they probably would have left the people of Masada alone, who really would care, but they started doing these raids. They were massacring caravans in the region not even military caravans. And so the Romans said, okay, we're going to take care of that issue. And you probably, if you've traveled to Israel, you know the story, right? And Ben Yair's, that Josephus tells about the final solution is the Romans are breaking in, they commit suicide, and to prevent the Romans from taking them captive, and so it's quite a dramatic story. But as far as manuscripts, mostly fragments, although there is a reoccupation there just by people, and some, I think, from the Second Jewish Revolt as well. Yeah.
So I have a question, a nutrition question, food question, because I read a lot that there's some claims that the Essenes actually followed a vegetarian diet, and they partly say because there's very few bones that were found there that they may use for animal sacrifice possibly, but do you know anything about that? Their dietary habits?
I don't really know. I mean, they're known for their calendar system, which is a little different. They're known for their ritual purity even before their main meal, but I'm not aware exactly of their dietary regimen.
Okay. Yes, we have a question right over here. And this woman is from Sweden. She came all the way from Sweden to visit us today. It's true.
Thank you. It has been very interesting to listen to both of you. My question is about shards and dating of shards. I wonder if you are using this molecular method where you look at the molecules and you can actually say exactly what geographical area the clay is taken from.
Yes, our projects have been involved with that. Petrographic analysis and neutron at the back we got a hand, and neutron activation analysis as well, which is what you're referring to. And that can be very helpful. You basically are taking a signature, creating a signature of the clay and its sort of mineralogical composition, and then looking for matches of sources where that clay came from. So that works best in areas where there's been a lot of sampling of clay sources in basically the geology of the region. But we're at a point now where it's pretty good. Cyprus, up into Turkey, certainly in the Israel, Jordan region. And so oftentimes we can say if the pottery was made locally or if it's part of an import, what's the trade relationship that's being developed at that time. So yes, that is a very important component of what we do.
Okay, we have a question from the last row in the church here.
Backseat Baptist. So was it at the Reagan Library, the Ten Commandments, is that the Deuteronomic or is that Exodus 5 verses? No, Deuteronomy 20. Deuteronomy. Just curious. So I remember back in 2008 seminary tour, one of our profs read from the original Isaiah 53 at the shrine of the book, and it was actually out for the 60th anniversary. It's really that fragile to light to have the original out, because I don't think it's been out since. And is there any thoughts on, not that the original has any more merit, but yet, well, actually it does, but if you can answer that, thanks.
Yeah. Which scroll did you see?
Isaiah.
Yeah, the great Isaiah scroll. Yeah, I thought so you said. Yeah, they have a really wonderful replica that they usually have on display there, like you were saying. What is fragile is the ink. The ink does break down in light, especially UV light. So actually, if you look back at the old photographs, the scroll fragments and where Frank Cross was working in Jerusalem is called the Rockefeller Museum. That's the original museum that the British, during the British Mandate period, built there in East Jerusalem. And you see the pictures, and they're in this very brightly lighted room with windows and the sunshine streaming in, and you're like, no, please. And they faded. All those fragments have faded a lot, and they've had to go back and rephotograph them with infrared and different frequencies of infrared to pick up the ink again. So yeah, it does seem to be a problem. It's not as stable as modern inks are. And I mean, they use soot ink a lot in antiquity, but the binders and the different elements of it do break down. So yeah, it is a concern. And you're right. Replica can be very good, but it's not quite the same as the original.
Okay, question over here. Let me get over here so we can get this. By the way, the scrolls that are at the Reagan Library, we have 3 sets of scrolls that have gone through there during the last 9 months. So the scrolls that you'll see tomorrow, or if you go to the Reagan Library to see them, those are out for 3 months, and then they go into complete darkness for 5 years before they'll ever come out again.
Very cool. I was wondering, for anyone who's interested in getting involved in either archaeology or just going to see where you guys have been discovering this, what options are available for us to be able to see you guys in action, actually undiscovering stuff? Is that still happening in this area? Do you have any insight for that?
Yes.
And also, can people go on trips with you and volunteer? That's what I want to do.
Yes, right. Actually, the next slide I had up, I forgot to forward it to it, but it's our Archaeology Discovery Weekend, which is in November, and you can come to our website and see it. But every year we do a different theme. This year it's Alexander the Great. Usually it's very tightly connected with biblical archaeology. This is sort of the story of Alexander the Great. Oh yeah, there you can see. So that's our theme this year, Alexander the Great and how he changed the world. And then the next slide or two there's some of the speakers. Many are well published and widely known. And then do one more screen. And that's our schedule. But this is all available online. If you go to lasierra.edu/archaeology or /CNEA, it was the same thing. CNEA is the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology.
And a couple of years ago, you had a Dead Sea Scrolls conference.
We
and
did.
You brought in some of the world's leading experts, and it's all on YouTube. So how do people watch that? If you want to get even more depth.
We have links on our website, so you can go there and follow to the Archaeology Discovery Weekend video series. So stay tuned for that. And then also to answer your question, we do archaeology digs in the Middle East, in Jordan. And we were supposed to be there this summer. Had it all planned, all set up. And then the Israel-Iran war started. And missiles were flying over. And we postponed for a week. We thought, maybe this will settle down real fast. Most airlines were canceling. Royal Jordanian was only flying in from the south. They would go into a holding pattern with their flights over the Gulf of Aqaba, and then when the all clear signal comes, they would fly up and slide in low to the airport. Well, we didn't think we could really take our students that way. And so we had to finally cancel, but we've rescheduled for next summer. So we have a program. It's basically the 18th or so of June. Our graduation's in the middle of June until the end of July. So it's a 6-week program. There are half season. First half, you can come if you want to do a half season. But the whole season is fun. You get to tour the country, see Petra, Jerash, the Roman period city, other sites. The baptismal site where John the Baptist was baptizing, that's on the Jordanian side. Remember, it says Bethany beyond the Jordan. That site has now been identified. Long tradition of Christian activity and worship there. And many other sites, Mount Nebo. So the project is a learning experience, and you can get college credit for it, university credit, or come as a non-credit, what we call volunteer. There's still a fee to cover room and board, that kind of thing.
So when it's not during the wartime, is it safe? You know, that's a lot of people are concerned about going to the Holy Land or even volunteering for archaeological digs and so forth. Is it safe when we're not in a war period?
It's very safe.
For 50 years, our project has been going on, and we've had to cancel twice for political reasons.
Oh, okay.
But if once you get there, you find out that Jordanians are very, very hospitable, kind people. There's no dangers. No.
Okay.
And we monitor things, and we have usually a local policeman we hire, retired, that has good, close local connections and knows what's going on. And so we do all those precautions too.
One question, I've heard that John the Baptist grew up in Qumran and his father was a priest in Qumran. Do you know anything about that?
Well, look, Zechariah was a priest in Jerusalem, so I'm not sure he would be an Essene if he was a serving priest in Jerusalem. Maybe you can make an argument, but that would seem to rule that out, because the Essenes didn't believe that the Jerusalem temple was legitimate. It was running appropriately. I think there are some sorts of connections there, but I think it's a step or two further away. But the fact that John is baptizing in the wilderness, he's in that area, there's clearly a lot of commonalities
I understand it's a half-a-day walk from Qumran to where he was baptizing. Is that right?
Yeah, it's about that, yeah.
Okay. Okay, we have time for one more question. Anyone have a question?
I would just like to say that there's another professor from La Sierra University here, Dr. Ron Osborne. Put up your hand so people can see who you are.
In your department?
He's the world expert on a man named John Widener, who is an Adventist who saved thousands of Jews and Allied airmen during World War II. It's a fascinating story, and sometime you ought to have him come and tell the story. He's got a center at La Sierra.
So talk to us about that. Well, maybe it will be a future thing. Okay, well, let's give Dr. Geraty and Dr. Bramlett a hand. And they will be up here if you'd like to see some of these artifacts, and Pastor Wendy will be in the back to show you some of her artifacts. And we thank you for coming. Now, those of you that are going to the Dead Sea Scrolls, now we have a group, 52 people from our church that are going to see them tomorrow morning. And that's closed. You can't get in on that now. But please meet at 8:45 sharp, right on the fountain right before you enter the Reagan Library. And so thank you for coming. We appreciate it. Come up and see some of these things. And there's some more information in the back about the Archaeology Institute. Thank you. You want to close in a prayer by Pastor Wendy?
Just on behalf of the Simi Valley Church, I just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy weekend to come. And our esteemed guests, thank you very much. Give them a big hand, please. And I know that as human beings, there's a lot more to learn, right? So as you see these things coming in the news, pay attention, okay? Ask your questions. I think curiosity and wonder, a sense of wonder, is one of the best things because we never stop learning no matter how old we are, right? So anyway, thanks. Let's just bow our heads for prayer. Lord God, the Dead Sea Scrolls are amazing, and the fact that they were preserved and the transmission for thousands of years is really miraculous when you think about it. And Lord, as we learn, we wrestle with the arguments, with the theories, and I know we all come to kind of our own kind of conclusions, but Lord, lead us in the way of truth. And that's our prayer. In your name, amen.